Alright, today we're going to talk about this bad boy right here. This is the Fujifilm XF 35mm f1.4. And this lens is really beloved. It got like a cult-like following, and for a very good reason too. So why am I reviewing this lens when I made a video about this lens a few years ago? Well, that's because people want to know if you can still use this lens for the Fujifilm X-T5. Now, Fujifilm made a list filled with lenses that are able to resolve the 40 megapixel sensor. And guess what? This lens isn't on it. I know it's quite sad, but just because it's not on the list doesn't mean that it's not usable. Well, that's what we're going to find out today. So let's get into it. So I just want to talk about my experience and talk about what I enjoy about this lens after being away from this lens for a few years when I replaced this lens with the XF 33mm f1.4. The one thing that I really like about this lens is the size. I forgot how tiny this lens is compared to the 33mm. The 33mm just looks so domineering when you place these two lenses side by side. So I was traveling light to Spain. I was only there for a couple of days, and in that couple of days, I was walking around the city, so having this lens attached to my X-T5 made things a little bit lighter. It made for a much better walking experience, if you ask me. And again, I know that it doesn't look like much, but the size and the weight does make a difference in the hand fatigue, in the person's mood throughout the day to go and photograph the town. You know, you start to contemplate whether or not you should just put this camera back in the bag. But I was able to last longer. That's what she said. And in doing so, I was able to take more photos because of it. I was able to immerse myself in this beautiful city, admiring the architecture, the locals, the tourists, and everything seems to pique my interest. I didn't feel the need to put the camera back into my bag because the X-T5 paired with the 35mm felt so light. It didn't feel like it was weighing me down, and it was on me the entire time, ready to fire whatever captures my eye. Now let's talk about the image quality of this lens. I love it. It reminded me of why I love this lens in the first place. Now it's still here on the 40 megapixel sensor, the same characteristics. It's quite charming and interesting, the bokeh. Now look at this right here. I haven't noticed this before, but this lens produced some unique looking bubbly bokeh balls, and I kind of like it. It reminds me of those vintage lenses in the past, and this is what makes this lens so fun, when it can produce some images with characteristics like this. Now shooting this at f1.4, however, is where this lens looks a little messy. It seems like on the 40 megapixel sensor, all the flaws are more amplified. When I zoom into 100%, I see the corners not being as tack sharp. I also see a lot more halation, and I don't remember seeing that much when I was using this lens on something like the X-T3 or the XS10. And there are a lot more chromatic aberrations than I could remember as well. But I find stopping it down to f4 will fix most of the issues. It will sharpen things up, and the image quality will get a little bit better, but it's still not as sharp as it can be. Now this might be a problem for people that like to crop their images a lot. When I zoom into my picture, I also see faces to have this smeared painterly look, and it reminded me of the Voigtlander 23mm f1.2. It is slightly softer than I would like on the 40 megapixel. Another thing I like about this lens is the close focusing distance. Now this lens can get 2 centimeters closer than the XF 33mm, and I know what you guys are going to say, okay, that 2 centimeters doesn't make a difference. But me being Asian, I'm telling you that it does. Every centimeter counts. Let's move on to some things that I don't like. The autofocus. I've had better. It does perform well on single point autofocus. It's when you start to track subjects using the AFC, it runs into problems. Sometimes it does this thing where it overshoots, then it comes back to acquire focus, and it just feels like it's unsure about itself. Another thing is the noise that it makes when it autofocuses. I am so used to my linear motor lenses being so silent. Coming back to this lens and hearing it again, I was like, whoa, what the fuck happened? I tried using the eye tracking paired with the X-T5 with this lens for a portrait session, and most of the shots turned out fine, but it's not really focused on the eyes. It does that back focus thing, which is really annoying with Fujifilm lenses and cameras. Like, it's not as confident as I would like. So can this lens be used on the 40 megapixel sensor, the X-T5 and the X-H2? Well, it depends on who you ask in this situation. But if you want to know my answer, I think it's usable. I think if it's for like weddings, commercial stuff, the safe bet is to go something like the XF 33mm f1.4, which can resolve the 40 megapixel sensor. But for the style of portraits that I shoot and the traveling, I would be happy using the 35mm with the X-T5 again. The lens has its charm with that I was reminded of again while I was using this lens for over the past few weeks. I'm also reminded by the flaws that this lens does have. And if you're someone that is a pixel peeper that likes sharp images, that crops in a lot, so you're going to want that detail to hold up when you do crop in, I would avoid using this lens because you may be frustrated with that soft look, especially on the X-T5. But if you're an artist, a creative person, if you want something a little bit more lightweight than, you know, these newer f1.4 lenses that came out over the past few years, and you're okay with the lack of autofocusing and the lack of weather sealing, and you just want some different looks to your images, I still think this lens is great on a 40 megapixel sensor. Again, everything's a bit more amplified, but it's not the end of the world. I had fun using this lens, traveling with this lens. Being able to hold the camera in my hands longer made photography more enjoyable because I was taking more photos instead of putting it away in my backpack and walking around the city not taking any photos. Now, I've done this before and it's annoying because I would go back to the hotel room and start to regret the fact that I didn't take enough photos and say shit like, oh, I wish I took more photos. Like, I'll give you an example. I was using this camera, the X-T5, with the XF33mm f1.4. I was in Italy walking around the city in Rome, doing the same thing I was doing in Spain. Every time I would take this lens out, even though I'm not complaining about the weight, subconsciously I would put this camera back into my bag. It's due to the size and the hand fatigue. You know, the hand fatigue, the way I think of it is like, oh, the hand fatigue hits me, I get annoyed because now I'm thinking about like putting this away, so I'm not really thinking about photography. Once I put the camera away with the lens, I'm thinking whether or not the next spot is gonna be a spot that's worth it to take out my camera, and it's just like this whole cycle repeats again. But using the X-T5 with this lens, the 35mm, I didn't think about that at all in Spain. I was just like, just nonchalantly walking about, being happy, and just waiting to fire at anything that I see that was deemed interesting. Like, again, the images still looks good in my eyes. The same characteristics that I love when I used to own this lens are still here on the 40 megapixel sensor, and it's making me rethink my kits now. I'm actually thinking of picking this lens back up and using it as a travel lens instead of the 33mm. So it would be a nicer option to have when it comes to size. Images are still great. I love taking images with it. I hope these images that I share with you today just proves to you how good this lens is. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you guys still use this lens on the 40 megapixel sensor? I know some people have different opinions on this matter, but I would love to know where you stand with this lens. Do you think it's okay to use on the X-T5? Honestly, I love this lens, and the reason why I sold it in the first place was because I picked up the 33mm a couple of years ago, and I just thought it was too redundant to have a similar focal length. But now for me, having two of them makes sense. Don't judge me while I am trying to justify this gas. Subscribe if you like more Fuji content, like this video, and if you're interested in this lens, I'll leave the links down in the description below. And thanks